Tonight is the big one. I gave you fair warning last week that we were going to be talking about trauma. And like I said last week, there may be some topics that we talk about or things that are said that might be a little triggering for you with this topic. It is for a lot of people. And so keep that in mind. If you need to stand up, go to the back of the room, take a walk, go outside, get a drink, whatever it is, feel free to do that. And that's fine. One of the things we're going to talk about tonight is how people who have survived trauma continue to deal with day-to-day life and how they do things differently. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. The Bible is full of trauma stories. Okay, there are things that happened in the Bible, whether they were natural or man-made, whatever you want to call it, where trauma happened, and we watch the unfolding of that in Scripture. And so keep that in mind. When you read the Bible, read it with a mental health lens. I do, probably because of my job. But read it with a mental health lens because you're going to see things that you might not have noticed before. David is one of my favorite Bible characters. And that dude lived a life of trauma. Joseph is another one. Peter, even some of the things he went through would qualify as traumatic. So when you read Scripture, when you read the Bible and those stories, read them with a lens of, at least of mental health, if not trauma as well, because you're going to start seeing it everywhere. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians and a lot of churches believe that this stuff is not for them. And I hope through these 5 weeks, you're going to learn a lot and see how it is for you, how you can use it to have better relationships and connect to people and understand people in a different way. Okay? So let's get started. So first of all, we have to define our terms. Unfortunately, pop culture loves to throw around words and definitions that aren't the actual definitions. Okay? So we're going to start at the top and go all the way. So abuse, we have to learn what abuse is. Abuse is to treat a person or an animal with cruelty or violence in a regular fashion. Okay? Some people will call abuse something that happens one time, and it might be. Most abuse happens many times over. Okay? So keep that in mind. There are 4 types of abuse: physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect is the last form of abuse. That has a whole different effect on the person, but neglect over time will have the same impact as abuse does on a person. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, and then again also tomorrow night. Or not tomorrow night, next week. If you want to be here, that's fine. Okay, trauma. Trauma results from the exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects. Okay? So a lot of things fall into that category. And here in a minute, we're going to talk about 2 different types of trauma that most people, one of them is obvious and one of them most people would not count as trauma. So experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety, sense of self, and the ability to regulate emotions. That's what we see all the time. The changes in a person's life happen after trauma, but it happens in their relationships. They begin to think about things differently. They approach relationships differently. Everything changes. Now, trauma has a couple of different variations on it. Complex trauma is multiple traumatic events. Developmental trauma is trauma that happens in childhood and goes forward. It is not a diagnosis in the DSM. We talked a little bit about that last time. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a diagnosis in the DSM, and it is a response to trauma. It's what happens to the individual after the traumatic event, okay? Tonight, we're not talking about abuse. We are talking about trauma, and we are talking about PTSD, mostly trauma. Because even if somebody goes through a trauma, they may not make it all the way into a full-blown PTSD symptomology, okay? So we're talking about trauma. PTSD comes along with that a lot of the time, so we're going to include that in what we're talking about. So, big T versus little t traumas. Okay, capital T traumas are those events that happen where most people look at that and say, oh yeah, that's going to leave a mark. That's going to hurt. Okay, natural disasters, loss of a loved one, big obvious things that anybody would look at and say, oh yeah, that's traumatic, okay? Little t traumas are different. Most people would look at a little t trauma event and go, that's just life, get over it, bad stuff happens, move on. But for that one person, the way it affects them, I'm talking about in their brain, the way it affects them is exactly the same as another person going through a natural disaster. They are the same. But again, a lot of people would look at that person and say, dude, you're faking it. Come on, that's no big deal. But for that person, it is. For 99 other people, it may not be. And it has to do with the constitution of the individual, what they can handle, how they've been brought up through relationships with emotions, how to handle things, all of that kind of stuff. Okay? Prevalence of trauma. I said when Paul and I, on that Sunday, were talking about it, I said 1 in 2. Guess what the stats are? 70%. That's 1 out of every 1.43 people. It's not even 1 out of 2. And again, this is only what we know about, because most traumas, most abuse situations are underreported. They don't tell people about it. These are just the ones we know about. Okay? This particular slide is about the symptoms of trauma, okay? I don't know if you can read it on the screen, but from the yellow one going clockwise, hypervigilance, re-experiencing, altered situation or altered attention, emotional dysregulation, interpersonal instability, belief systems affected, somatic symptoms, and avoidance. That is all the stuff that happens with a person through trauma. Okay, the stuff on the outside is how you treat it, but I'm giving it to you for the stuff on the inside. Every one of those categories, every one of the colors, is a category in the big, thick purple book that I have to use of criteria. If you don't meet every single one of those, you don't qualify for a traumatic event or PTSD or whatever we're talking about, okay? Every single one of those areas is affected for a person who's had a traumatic event. Now you go up to complex trauma. Somebody who has had multiple events happen, they're going to have all kinds of symptoms, okay? Prevalence of PTSD, okay? 8% for women, which is double what it is for men. And again, these are only the ones we know about. So there could be a little bit of skew in this. It's also higher for, global population is 9.2%. Other countries have a lot more experiences that we would call traumatic that they call everyday life, okay? And it's higher for veterans than it is for civilians. Veterans who go to war, whether that's Iraq, whether that's Afghanistan, World War II, World War I, and anything in between, are going to experience, sometimes on a daily basis, traumatic events. What we would call a traumatic event, they don't. Okay, there's a certain instrument that I use to diagnose PTSD. it's a different scale for military or ex-military than it is for civilians. You have to score more points on the military one to qualify for PTSD diagnosis. They're basically taught, leave your emotions in the barracks and go. That's really hard to do because we're human. God made us a certain way. So when they go out into the field with a 50-pound rucksack and their weapon, they're going to see some stuff. And they're also not going to stop. I've sat in my office and listened to an ex-military talk about getting shot by an AK-47 and sticking a tampon in it. And they keep going because that will stop the bleeding. But the military didn't issue that. People back home sent them care packages of, hey, we need this, that, and the other, because they knew what worked in the field, but the government didn't give it to them. So they would carry around in their khakis a pocket full of tampons, because when they got shot, they just pull one out and stuff it in and keep going and deal with the bullet later. For us, oh, dude, I'm going to have to sit on the couch for a while. That's not me. I wasn't trained that way. I'm pretty sure most of you weren't either. We would call that a traumatic experience. They would call it a day on the job. But then they come back and they go into civilian life, and there's no more hierarchy of you do what people say. You know what the number one thing that upsets veterans is in civilian world? People not following orders from their boss. Military calls it orders. We call it wishes. Drives them up the wall because they're coming from a culture that says you're told to do something, you do it. You don't even think. It drives them up the wall. And a veteran owning a company, trying to manage employees, that's a whole other bag of cats. So think about what the person's history and upbringing contributes to how they handle this stuff. It's not anywhere in the literature, but here's what I've learned after doing this for 25 years. If I'm sitting with a person and they say, okay, I've been through a traumatic event, and I know their history, I know what happened all the way back, then I can say, okay, then how you're handling this makes 100% sense. It makes sense. So can we say also, if we know this person's history before the traumatic event happens, can we predict how they're going to respond to a traumatic event? I can't say that with any statistical confidence, but maybe. Because how the person handles relationships, how they handle upset, how they handle emotions, how they treat people, how they communicate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all contributes to what they're going to do in the moment the trauma happens. Is it predictable? No. But can we think far enough ahead that if a trauma happens for this individual, how are they going to handle it? And what's that going to look like? And what's going to work and what's not going to work? There is a lot that we can do on the preventative side, because we can't stop bad things from happening in our life. But there's a lot we can do on the preventative side to say, hey, if this stuff happens, here's your game plan. Here's the stuff you've been through, here's the stuff that's going to hang you up, and here's the stuff that's going to help you. And let us teach you some more stuff. Because it's going to happen, one out of every 1.43 people. It's going to happen. So how are we going to handle it? We all know somebody who's been in a car wreck, right? They've been through a car wreck, but they won't drive through that intersection again. They'll go 5 miles out of their way to go around it to get to wherever they're going, but they won't go through that intersection again. Why? Because they're afraid it's going to happen again. Just driving through that intersection gives them flashbacks, causes stress, causes anxiety, whatever. They'll avoid it like the plague. We all know somebody like that. Maybe some of you have been through that. But that's what we do. What else do we do? What else are the patterns that we engage in around this kind of stuff? or your loved one. Somebody you know is probably living a trauma-based life. And when you look at them, what do you think? Do you think the things they do are crazy? Well, for you it would be. For them it's surviving. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. So again, all those percentages, just the ones we know about. Okay, symptoms. This is the master list of symptoms for PTSD. You'll find all kinds of stuff on the internet about this stuff. This is a collection of a lot of stuff. Basically, the two biggest ones that we look for are avoidance patterns and intrusive thoughts, which flashbacks qualify as intrusive thoughts. If you're in a situation and all of a sudden you feel like you're back in it again, that's a flashback. And sometimes, especially closer to the event, people can't tell the difference in reality. They actually think they're going through it again. And so they're going to respond like they're going through it again. Or even worse, they're going to try to stop it this time. But it's actually not happening. So what they're doing is going to cause problems. I used to work at a children's abuse and neglect center in Wickenburg, Arizona. It was the old Merv Griffin Dude Ranch. Okay, so a bunch of Hollywoods owned it way back. They turned it into, Wickenburg, Arizona used to be the dude ranch capital of the world. Now it's the treatment center capital of the world because all the dude ranches were turned into treatment centers. This was one of them. But it was kids, 4 to 11. We had kids there who had survived horrible stories, and when they came in, they would come in either with a CASA, a CPS worker, sometimes the police, people like that, and they would see that it's safe. The staff, other kids, they all had cottages. It was fine. But beginning on the first night, they would do the same things in the residential facility that they had been doing the night before in whatever place they were in. They would do the same things, which were destructive in the facility. But in their previous experience, it's what kept them safe. Because when you make your abuser not want to touch you by smearing feces all over yourself, that works. It doesn't work in a residential facility. And it triggers everybody else. So just because the situation is over doesn't mean it's going to stop. And that happens every day. This is just a graphic of the same stuff you just saw. Again, we're talking primarily about trauma. The way this stuff is pervasive in somebody's life is unstoppable. Okay? It changes the way you think. It changes your relationships. It changes your view of safety. There was a lady who went to work one morning. It was a Monday morning. And she lived in one of those cities that has a subway. And she got on the subway and rode to work just like she always does. Same car, same people going to work, same everything. And she had a panic attack. She made it through the panic attack, got to work, or got to the station by her work, got out. As soon as she got out of the subway car, panic attack stopped. She goes up to work. She's like, what was that? She makes it through work. She goes home. Same thing happens on the way home. This lady's never had a panic attack before. Day 2, Tuesday, she goes to work, has a panic attack. She goes up to her boss and says, I gotta go see a doctor. I don't understand what's happening. He says, go. She goes and finds a doctor. Doctor checks her out, nothing wrong. She goes home. Same thing happens on the way home. Third day, Wednesday, she's like, I don't know what's going on with me, but I gotta figure this out. She takes the subway into the city again, has another panic attack, but this time she doesn't go to a doctor, she goes to a psychologist. And she gets in an emergency session, they start talking, and it takes them a couple of days, repeated sessions, but what she eventually finds out, or figures out, is over the weekend, before the Monday she had the first panic attack, they repainted the inside of the subway cars the same color as the color on the wall in the bathroom that she was raped in at a restaurant. All it took was the color on the wall. Now that had happened decades ago, but it was the exact same color. So they did the work they needed to do and resolved it. But that's how subtle the triggers of trauma can be. Okay, so what are we talking about? I'm going to use this chart every week. We're talking about biopsychosocial damage. Okay, somebody has done something evil in this person's life. Okay, and they are greatly affected by it. Does that also cause suffering? Yes. Might they also sin in their response to it? Yes. So we could be talking about all three, but we're definitely talking about biopsychosocial damage. When the trauma happens in a person's life, their initial reaction causes things to happen immediately. Exhaustion, confusion, sadness, anxiety, agitation, numbness, dissociation, physical arousal, and blunted affect. They come out of it like a zombie. That's what those last three mean. They come out of it like a zombie. Okay? Dissociation. Not disassociation, dissociation. Dissociation is where a person, you ever heard somebody talk about they left their body and watched it happen from the corner of the room? That's dissociation. It's a survival tactic. Okay? And when they tell the story, they don't tell the story from here, they tell it from up there. They're looking at themselves involved in the whatever happened. I had a lady I was working with, she had multiple traumas in her past, and she would sit on my couch and we'd do an hour session, and I didn't catch this for a while. It took me quite a while to get onto it. She would dissociate about every 2 minutes, but her face didn't change, her mannerisms didn't change, and she would still talk, but she was gone. And after I learned what her patterns were, I could tell the difference in the voice. I could tell the difference in the eyes. I could tell the difference in her mannerisms. And by the time we were done, it wasn't once every 2 minutes. It was about once a month in our sessions. So that's progress. But that's how often it happened. That's how easily she was triggered. I got up one time, we were in an office where my chair was here, she was on a couch probably 15 feet away, and there's another couch on the side. Well, to be closer and have a closer conversation, I got up and sat in the other couch. Guess what she told me the next week? That she got triggered and dissociated the entire rest of the session. And I sat in that couch for 45 minutes. And I didn't know it. So I didn't move again. And if I did, I told her I was going to before I did. But that's how subtle some of this stuff is. You know how you can sit down in your chair or your couch, flip on the TV, and you can watch a 30-minute TV show, and at the beginning you see the show come on, and all of a sudden the credits are rolling, you don't remember what happened in the show? That's a dissociation experience. You ever driven your car from point A to point B? Some of you are starting to freak out. You ever driven your car from point A to point B and you arrive safely, but you don't remember making all the turns? Same thing. Sometimes we call it daydreaming. It's a little bigger than that. Daydreaming is you're usually still and staring in one place for X amount of time. Dissociation, you're still living life. You're moving, grooving, talking, doing things, paying for things, talking to people, giving people instructions. They don't know. And a lot of people, a lot of trauma survivors believe that they are really good at hiding it. They'll dissociate on you in the middle of a conversation and you won't know a thing. You'll walk away going, wow, the last half of that conversation was kind of stale, but okay. You won't get it, but they'll be like, glad that's over. Because they dissociated. They dissociated to survive. Something triggered them. And dissociating is how you survive it. It's one tactic. But it happens all the time. So the question was the last two things, what do they mean? Physical arousal is a heightened physical state in your body. It's kind of like hypervigilance, but not all the way there. You're more aware of things going on around you. You're highly focused on anything and everything that's coming around you. Your heart rate is up. Your breathing is up. All of that stuff is elevated. Blunted affect means, how's your day? It's okay. There's just no emotion. So there's tons and tons and tons of research on trauma, especially since about 1995 was when it really kicked off. So, and part of that was because of the ability to do brain scans. That's when that started becoming more easily accessible through science. So people who have experienced trauma, once they've experienced the trauma, we can predict certain things. Just like with children of divorce, we can predict certain things in their life, okay? Statistically, not the individual. So people who've experienced trauma are 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop an STD, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times to use antidepressant medication, 3 times more likely to be absent from work, 3 times more likely to experience depression. They should have put that one on the other side. 3 times more likely to have serious job problems, 2.5 times more likely to smoke tobacco, and 15 times more likely to commit suicide. Just because they've had one trauma in their life. Now, put that in the context of complex trauma. Somebody who's had 3, 4, 5, 6 traumas. This has a huge impact on people. Like I said, it changes everything. This is how people themselves describe their PTSD, their trauma. It's constantly looking over your shoulder and having difficulty trusting people. It's not just something you can walk away from. That's the hypervigilance. Once a trauma has happened in your life, you are constantly looking over your shoulder. You do not want anybody to sneak up on you. Therefore, you're going to sit in the corner or with your back against the wall in a restaurant. When you go places, you're not going to go into the middle of a crowd. You're going to stay on the edge of the crowd, preferably near an exit. You're going to always look at people suspiciously. You're going to look at them as if they could hurt me. How could they hurt me? Where do I need to be in relation to them? When a trauma survivor walks into a crowd or is even on the edge of the crowd, they'll look around the crowd and know who the abusers are by their mannerisms, especially the manner in which they've been hurt. You ever heard people talk about that radar you have, that so something off with that person, I need to stay away from that person, that's what they're talking about. They can feel it. They have this experience that has taught them stay away from certain kinds of people. So they do. Triggers can come from anywhere at any time. A smell, a look, a glance, a vibe, a dream, how someone treats you even. You are unable, as hard as you try, to turn it off. This is the subway story. Okay? The littlest thing can set it off. Now, there's a big difference between unresolved and resolved trauma. Remember we talked about that a couple of weeks ago? Resolved means it's not having the negative impact on the individual anymore. So what percentage do you think of people that have a traumatic experience in their life have resolved it so that there's no lasting negative effects? I'm going to say it's less than 10%. Most people will live the rest of their life with their trauma being unresolved and going through daily life putting up with all of these complications. Because, again, they were told, this is just life. You have to suck it up, buttercup. You know that feeling you get when someone jumps out and scares you and you are on high alert for a few minutes? That alertness never goes away for me. That was said by a lady. That's the hypervigilance. Once you've been hurt in a traumatic event, you never want it to happen again. So you're going to make darn sure it doesn't happen by being on high alert. Hello, no more adrenal glands. Because it takes adrenaline to keep that state of hypervigilance. It's like when you watch a scary movie and you're on edge the entire time, except that's how you live all day, every day. You're literally afraid of everything. For some people, that turns into agoraphobia. What's agoraphobia? You don't leave the house. You're afraid of crowds. You're afraid of people. It's like being hit by a car and you never see the car coming. It knocks you down, and when you try to get up, another car hits you again. For somebody living with trauma, they are constantly hit every day. Therefore, the dissociation experiences, but also they can't trust anything. They can't trust anybody because they're constantly getting hit. Last one, PTSD is a bunch of nightmares during the day. I lose grips on where I am, and I get lost in the memory. It's like I'm not even where I actually am. It feels so real, and the next thing I wake up and do not know how I got to where I am now. There are some forms of dissociation where you start in one place and you wake up somewhere else and you don't know how you got there, but you were eyes awake the entire time. That does happen to people. And if they're in public, they can be easily taken advantage of in that state. So other people, especially experienced evil people, will take advantage of somebody in that state. So this is from a place in the UK. It's basically a one-pager on everything about trauma. I don't know how big it is in your notes, but it covers a lot of stuff. I'm going to point out the three circles: prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the anterior cingulate cortex. Okay? Basically, prefrontal cortex is right here behind your forehead. It's the last part of the brain to develop. It finishes developing at approximately 25 years old. Again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. Okay? So that is the place in the brain that handles judgment, high emotion regulation, and decision making. 25. And we give you a license at 16 and you vote at 18. So the prefrontal cortex, when trauma happens, it goes dark. It's one of those parts of the brain that gets severely shut down. Because basically when trauma happens, you go into survival mode. Where's survival mode? We talked about, yep, in the brainstem. That's right. We talked about it 2 weeks ago. So brainstem takes over, which is where the amygdala is. The amygdala is part of the brainstem. So the person's ability to concentrate and learn is diminished. Also, their ability to regulate whether they're safe or not and calm down and sleep are all disrupted. Trauma survivors don't sleep. They stay awake in bed at night because hypervigilance doesn't turn off. And what did we say about the, I just lost the word. When you go to sleep, your brain switches modes, hard mode and soft mode. Remember that from a couple weeks ago? Soft mode is when your sympathetic and parasympathetic. There you go, thank you. Sympathetic nervous, or parasympathetic is what kicks into gear when you go to sleep. It's what repairs your body tissues and your brain. If you're in hypervigilance mode all day, it doesn't turn off when you sleep. If you're in hypervigilance mode, parasympathetic can't turn on. So there's no healing. There's no healing that happens in your body. There's no healing that happens in your brain. So hypervigilance is a huge problem for people who have survived trauma because it never turns off. Now, the anterior cingulate cortex, I would say that's probably loosely related to, or maybe majorly related to, the limbic system, because it has to do with your emotions. All of these centers in the brain are underactivated. In other words, trauma shuts them down. Their ability to do those things just doesn't exist anymore until they're reactivated or activated to a higher level. So if somebody has a trauma history and you tell a joke, they're probably not going to laugh. Or if it was 2 decades ago, they've learned enough through social cues that they're supposed to laugh when other people laugh, so they laughed, but they didn't know if it was funny or not. Because all of these parts of their brain are shutting down or have shut down. So like I've said, trauma changes your brain. We professionals like me, we call it trauma brain. Okay, when you have trauma brain, stuff gets a little weird, but it's okay because they're still living through life. One of the things I say to my clients often is, it's amazing you've done so well with where you're at. And they look at me like I'm crazy. And here's why I say it. Because they've survived. Most people struggle just to survive a hangnail. Put them in a more serious situation, give them some complex trauma, give them some of these symptoms. A lot of people go straight for drugs and alcohol, which is why most of your addictions are tied back to some kind of event. Because the drugs and the alcohol is how they're coping with the feelings and the thoughts of the event that they don't want to have. So if they don't go with drugs and alcohol, what are they going to go to? It could be food, it could be exercise, it could be work, it could be all kinds of things, or they just shut it all down, dive under the covers, and they're done for a while, which means months. So this trauma changes everything, and it starts in the brain. So processing information is difficult on every level. You guys know my wife has 7 kids. Well, she bore 7 kids. We have 7 kids. That's better said. Thank you. And when she would have a baby, for a while afterwards, she called it pregnancy brain. Because you forget a lot of stuff. You have other things you're paying attention to. This is very similar. Trauma brain is Other stuff just doesn't matter. I'm focused on the stuff that's going to keep me alive. I'm focused on the stuff that I can trust, which is very little. Which leads us to the next one. Everyone and everything becomes untrustworthy. You cannot trust it because you don't know if it's going to try to take a bite out of you. So you treat everything as if it's dangerous. Even loved ones, even people you have close relationships with, friends, people you've trusted your whole life, people you know mean you no harm. But because of the trauma, nope, I can't trust you. Now put yourself in the trauma survivor's shoes. If you had people that you could trust and now you can't trust, how do you deal with that? How do you begin to see things? And by the way, one of the people you now can't trust is God. Because God let it happen. And if God would let it happen, he might do it again. A lot of people struggle with their faith. If something traumatic has happened in their life, they struggle with their faith with God. Because if God's up there and he saw this happening and he didn't stop it, that must mean I deserved it. And I'm not going to like a God like that. At least that's what they say. The level of conversations I have in my office with people about God, especially related to trauma, is impressive. And again, a lot of it is, well, that's fine for everybody else, Todd. Yes, God would forgive them and God, whatever. But God would never forgive me. God can't love me. I'm unlovable. This thing that happened makes me bad. It's my fault. Therefore, now I have to be perfect so that it never happens again. God can do whatever he wants, but I have to be perfect because that's the only way I can make sure that nobody's going to take a bite out of me again. It's a lie, but that's how they live every day. And working through all that takes a lot of time. It's not going to change in 1 or 2 or 10,000 conversations. You're going to need a lot. For a trauma survivor, everything is a possible distraction. And sometimes they want the distraction, and sometimes they don't. But everything becomes a distraction. Right now, I'm going to take a shot at something, and I could be wrong. But there's somebody in this room who's been dissociating while I've been talking, and they're staring at a water bottle. Because that's the only thing keeping them glued to their seat. Don't look around for the water bottles. Or something, a pen, a piece of paper, a chair, a dot on the wall, anything that they can stare at and distract themselves with so that they don't have to voluntarily participate in what's being heard, what's being talked about. And like we said, 1 out of every 1.43 people, you're at tables of 8 right now. You know how many people we're talking about. Everybody's untrustworthy. It also goes to the level of, am I being betrayed? I've already been betrayed once, which means it could happen again. Is it this person? Is it that person? Is it everybody? Is everybody going to betray me? Is that all I'm good for, is being betrayed? That's how some of the thinking happens. Memories don't work the same way for a trauma survivor as they do for people who haven't experienced trauma. Normal memory functioning has 5 components. I think we talked about this before, TICEs: triggers, images, cognitions or beliefs, emotions, body sensations. Normally, when an event happens in our life, it creates a memory. Imagine a conveyor belt going through my head, okay? Those 5 things ride in on the conveyor belt. They go into my brain swishes them around, creates a nice, neat little package, and it comes out the other side on the conveyor belt. With a trauma experience, that's not what happens. Event happens, conveyor belt, 5 pieces, goes in, it's like a grenade goes off. Notice nothing comes out the other side. Now, that traumatic memory is scattered and inserted into all kinds of other memories. So when in my office, when we're talking about a traumatic event, here comes another story that's not about the trauma, but it's about 10 or 15 years ago and something else that happened. But there's a detail in that story that's the same as the trauma story. And now they're mixed to where the trauma survivor can't tell them apart. We call it spider webs. In the brain of a person who survived a trauma, their memories are spider webbed. They all cross each other. And pulling those things apart and repackaging them and in an attempt to resolve the trauma and make it come out the other side on the conveyor belt, that's what takes a long time. Because for them, they're all connected now. And I can't tell them apart. So my job becomes helping them take them apart and not let them affect each other so they can process what they need to process and let it ride out the other side. So one of the things that happens with a trauma survivor is their sense of time is altered. Okay, on this graphic, pay attention to the column to the far right. Loss of sense of time. I had a lady I was working with. I was actually doing couples work with them. And she was late for everything, at least 5 minutes, everywhere she went. And it drove her husband nuts because he was the 5 minutes early is late kind of guy. And so they were always fighting about it. Well, it came up in one of our sessions, so we talked about it. And what she was describing was, okay, I'm going to make dinner, and then we got to go to this thing. So she makes dinner, and then they go to this thing, but they arrive 30 minutes late. She started dinner on time. And during dinner, they had 2 girls. During dinner, she separated 3 fights. She dealt with this, that, and the other, which caused dinner to roll late, which caused them to leave the house late. In her mind, they were on time when they left the house. She didn't realize they were 30 minutes late. Because when she stopped to handle the girls' fights and all the other little things, time stops. You ever noticed when you're sitting somewhere and you're not doing anything, and you close your eyes and then you open them, you can't tell how much time passed because there was nothing else to record. You weren't listening to something, you weren't watching something happen, you were just staring at a wall. Try it sometime. Just close your eyes and try to count how long it is. Have a clock nearby or something. But no noise, no visuals. It's very hard to record when nothing's happening. But when stuff's happening all the time, we record everything. But for a trauma survivor, they lose their sense of time because for them, the trauma happened 5 minutes ago. Even if it was 20 years ago, it just happened. So everything else that happens in their day goes out the window. They're surviving. So their sense of time, for a trauma survivor, coming to church 5 minutes late, to them it's on time. Because I didn't want to walk through that lobby with 500 people in it anyway. So everything is different. Seriously, their sense of time is lost. If I give somebody a piece of homework, I give a lot of homework in my sessions. So I give them a piece of homework. They come back the next week, And I'll say, did you do your homework? And they're like, you gave me homework? Yeah, you wrote it down. Oh, yeah. Oh, I thought that was like a month ago. And it was last week. Spider webs, everything's connected. That means everything's disjointed as well. Here's the big one. For a person who has survived a traumatic event, what they think about themselves and the world around them completely changes. We talked a little bit earlier about how they can't trust anybody. But now they also can't trust themselves. Because remember, it's their fault the trauma happened. So if it's their fault the trauma happened, they could make it happen to themselves again. And if it happened, I'm from the 80s, so I talk about malls. If it happened in the mall, they'll go back to the mall not thinking, oh yeah, a trauma could happen. Because for them, it's not about the mall, it's about the people. So they'll actually put themselves in a dangerous situation, or a party, a high school party, or a college party. It could be anything. They'll put themselves right back in a dangerous situation, not realizing situational awareness or anything related to that, because they'll pin it to something else. Or they'll desperately want to be normal, so they'll participate in everything that everybody else does, but not be aware of how they contribute to it. And part of it is how they believe about themselves and the world around them. What we believe guides everything that comes next. What we think, what we feel, what we do. About life, about friends, about family, about God, about the Bible, about everything. And if we don't understand how those things play together, we can come up with some really weird conclusions. But like we've talked about, everything becomes unsafe, untrustworthy. And some of those are the beliefs that I hear people talk about in my office. I'm worthless. I'm damaged goods. I'm not wanted. I'm unlovable. People aren't safe. People aren't trustworthy. And that's not just the people at the party. That's everybody. And oh, by the way, if it was a guy that did it to me, I'm never going to trust another guy ever in my life. So everybody becomes untrustworthy. Everybody becomes unsafe, including the self and God. This is a chart that I've used many times to help, especially spouses, understand what's going on with their loved one. That same couple I was talking about where she made it everywhere 5 minutes late. I don't remember if this was part of the same conversation or a different conversation, but her husband was complaining about several different things. And what I heard him talking about and then how she responded to it cued me into the two triangles on this graphic. When I say a trauma survivor goes into survival mode, what I mean is they're surviving 1 second to the next. They literally aren't predicting 5 minutes ahead. It's part of the reason why they're late. They're literally surviving 1 second at a time. And we were sitting there, they were sitting on the couch, and the husband was complaining. So then his wife, I asked his wife to say a couple of certain things, and she did, and it was partly she had 3 different traumas in her background. And so she was tying those to her everyday life now. And I pulled out this graphic and I showed her husband the right side up triangle. So the triangle that looks like a regular triangle. And what the colored bars mean is the wider the bar, the more time they spend in that category per day. So on a right side up triangle, for a trauma survivor, they spend the most amount of time in their day surviving. They spend the least amount of their time thinking. That's the top part of the triangle. Notice on a typical development individual, the triangle is upside down. They spend the least amount of time surviving and the most amount of time thinking their way through things. That is not what a trauma survivor does. They are surviving 1 minute to the next, 1 second to the next. Every trauma survivor that I've talked to, I show them this graphic, and they go, oh yeah, that's me. And they're pointing to the right side up triangle. So they themselves are describing it as, I spend the most amount of time in my day just surviving. You want me to think about something? No, I got to survive first. And then maybe we'll talk about social and emotional stuff and maybe some regulation. But not much, because I got to survive first. So that's how they spend their day. This slide is about neglect. So imagine a tree gets planted. You have a little sapling and a couple of roots that go down in the ground. And the more that tree spends in the dirt, the more roots it's going to establish down under the ground. Okay? And then over time, it's going to grow from a sapling into a much bigger tree. Okay? If the ground, the surface we walk on, is birth, and going down and up is a matter of time, then everything underground happened before birth, everything above ground happened after birth. Okay? So the more time we go through, the bigger the tree gets. That's us growing into a mature adult. Okay? When neglect happens in a person's life, there are two forms of neglect, pre-birth and post-birth. When post-birth neglect happens, it might blunt the tree a little bit. You might have a few less leaves, you might have a few less limbs, but it's still going to grow just as tall as it would have. There's going to be effects from that trauma or from that neglect on the individual. But all of the innate capability that was given into that sapling, is still there. But when pre-birth neglect happens, it prunes roots, which prunes capacity. So anytime pre-birth neglect happens for an individual, if you're looking at this from a scientific viewpoint, and God can do whatever he wants whenever he wants, so this is one of those but God kind of things. When pre-birth neglect happens and roots get pruned, capacity gets pruned. I'm not talking about how tall they grow. I'm talking about their ability to do math, their ability to remember definitions, their ability to recognize social cues, etc.
Can you give an example of pre-birth?
Examples of pre-birth neglect. Smoking, alcohol, drug use, off the charts anxiety will have a chemical pre-birth effect. Abuse, physical abuse to the mom, to her body. Incredible amounts of stress can do it as well. Anything, you guys know this, anything you do to the mom the baby feels, that's what we're talking about. If that's inordinately bad to the mom, it's also going to be inordinately bad to the baby. So it's going to have an effect on the overall longevity of that child's life. What's their social life going to be like? What's their intellectual life going to be like? All of those things are going to be affected. Okay? For a trauma survivor getting started into recovery is very difficult, because remember, they don't trust, and they don't think anybody else is at fault. They blame themselves, so they think it's a them problem. Okay? From the time the event happens, you begin a clock. Okay? I can't even talk about PTSD for 6 months. Okay? You can talk about acute forms of it, but that's a different thing. A minimum of 1 month passes after the event happens just to feel like you can breathe normally again. And it doesn't mean everything in life is normal. That means you're just beginning to start thinking like and feeling like a normal person again. Between 0 and a month, all bets are off. It's anybody's guess what you're going to get. And again, it depends on that person's past. Diet, sleep, and exercise play a huge role. The more normalized you can make diet, sleep, and exercise for a trauma survivor, the better chances they have at recovering well. Okay? Now remember, trauma survivors don't sleep. Why? Hypervigilance, which shuts off what? Parasympathetic, which shuts off what? Healing. So sleep is important. If you can get them to sleep, it makes huge strides. Self-care. A trauma survivor does not do self-care because they're too much into guilt. They blame themselves. They think it's their fault. They're not going to take care of themselves because they think they deserved it. So they're not going to take care of themselves as much as they would without that event having happened. So it's something they have to learn or be taught to do. Just because you've done it for 20 years prior to that doesn't mean you're going to do it after that. It's a whole different ballgame. Train your responses. Talking with or working with somebody who survived a trauma is like a whole new education in how to do relationships and how to do life. Okay? Retraining yourself how to have a conversation, how to shake somebody's hand, how to walk into a room, how to keep yourself safe without doing the hypervigilance thing, recognizing situations that aren't okay versus okay. That's more so for teenagers and young adults, but it can even happen with somebody who's got decades on them. Training your responses to not overreact to a situation, okay? Remember we talked about flashbacks. If somebody can recognize, okay, this isn't happening to me, I'm witnessing this right now, and I'm okay, I just don't like what's happening. That right there could take a year to develop. Just that kind of thinking. Separating what's happening right in front of them from what happened in the past. So that's part of training your responses. Working with your feelings is all about accurately communicating, this is how I feel about the thing that happened, and this is how I feel about the thing happening in front of me right now. Walking away from guilt and shame into, I get to have my feelings. I get to feel whatever I need to feel about this situation, and that's okay. It's not wrong. Because so many people have told them since the event happened that the way they feel about it or think about it is wrong. What do you tell somebody when they blame themselves for the bad thing that happened in their life? You tell them they're wrong. They've got decades of that. So retraining them how to deal with their emotions is a huge part of the process. The guilt is only the first step. Then we got everything else. And stress reduction, we talked about this when we talked about anxiety. Stress reduction techniques, any amount of stress you can reduce will help the PTSD symptoms. Remember, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The stress of the event and how it reverberates through their life creates stress in their everyday. That's what we need to get rid of. It's part of what we need to get rid of. Okay? A couple of quotes and a Bible verse for you. It isn't about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. When a traumatic event happens in a person's life, They don't focus on what happened. They focus on who they are because it happened. That's wrong. They mix the two. It's not about who you are. Who you are is a God-made thing. What happened is evil. And getting a trauma survivor to say that takes some work. Because they don't see it as evil. They see them as the problem. Trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. I agree with that. Because again, 1 out of every 1.43, and that's just the ones we know about. It's happening around us every day. You know people. Whether you know their story or not, you know people who have survived a trauma, and they're just doing the best they can to get through the day. And maybe it's you. Maybe you're the one who's been doing decades of surviving 1 minute to the next. This is where God's word is paramount. God's word, our prayer life, and our ability to take what God has for us through his word, through other people. Changing the mindset from, it's my fault, I'm a bad person, I'm unworthy because of this, or worthless because of this, to God loves me, God has a plan for me, there's evil in the world, and it happened to me. That's a huge milestone move right there. And it takes a lot of work. Just like it did for Joseph. When Joseph's father died, his brothers were scared. Because they thought, now that our father is dead, he has nothing to stop him from getting retribution on us for what we did to him. But that's not what Joseph did. Joseph knew that God set the whole thing up and allowed it all to happen so that his people could survive Egypt. So, I think that's my last slide. Yep. Questions?
On the 2 triangles.
Hold on a minute. Let's get the mic because the people on the video won't hear you.
Thank you. On the 2 triangles, inverted relative to one another, what did regulation refer to?
So regulating our body, all the way down to breathing, heart rate, all of those physiological things, and regulating our thoughts, regulating our emotions. So the ability to keep the train on the track, so to speak, instead of letting it run wild. Okay, we can let our minds run away with us, we can let our feelings run away with us. Keeping all of that between the gutters on a bowling alley, that's regulation. We'll talk more about that next week. He's coming.
You gave kind of like an acrostic. I think you said it was TICES and triggers is the first one. Could you go through those again, please?
So the 5 components of memory, the acrostic is TICES, T-I-C-E-S. So triggers is the first one, images, cognition or beliefs, then emotions, then body sensations. All 5 of those together make up a memory. That's how our brain stores it. Who's next? hold on. He's got it back there.
Does divorce and loss of a loved one count as a traumatic event?
Loss of a loved one can. Divorce, it depends on how it happens, what's all involved in it. The impacts on children of divorce, that's a whole nother class of study, and those impacts are huge. Depending on the relationship between the two parents, how the whole thing was handled, how it was played out, it could be traumatic, it may not be. But again, we go back to big T, little t. Little t, yeah, it could get several people. Big T, not necessarily. But for that one person, it might be. Loss of a loved one, yeah, that's probably going to be considered traumatic for a while.
A follow-up. On the slide, it says 70% of adults in the U.S. have experienced some type of traumatic event. So what are the main traumatic events in the 70% of adults?
It's literally anything. It's car accidents, natural disasters, loss of a loved one, fires, it's abuse, it's all kinds of stuff. And I believe that statistic was 70% in the last year. It's a rolling statistic. She had a question down here, Alex. Oh, you don't have, no? Okay, good job. Who's next?
When you, on the slide with the tree, and you talked about the prenatal, the injuries there affecting their capacity, is there anything that can be done to correct that?
Scientifically, no, and that's where I say, but God. Because of what happens to the physiology in that when a child is pre-birth and they experience neglect, it has the physiological impact on the developing brain. So that's where the pruning happens. But again, if that happens post-birth, the brain structures are already there, it's not going to have the pruning effect. Did that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Wait for the mic. Down here.
If a child is very young, like 4 or 5 years old, and they experience a traumatic event, do those events come back, or do they, have the same response as an adult that was in a car accident or something later in their life?
Okay, so possibly, probably, but not necessarily. It depends on how they intake the whole thing. And the closer they are to language acquisition makes a big difference. If the trauma happens pre-verbal, they'll never be able to talk about it, but they'll play it out physically all the time because their body's still trying to expel it. So that makes a difference. Does it come back to them over and over? It's not uncommon. Let's say a traumatic event happens for a 5-year-old. It's not uncommon for them to go into counseling and then 5 years later do it again, and 5 years later do it again, and 10 years later do it again, because their brain development and their understanding of language, relationships, emotions, and everything else is all growing all at the same time, and so is their ability to understand it. So for somebody who experiences a trauma at a younger age, you're much less likely to get complete resolution because they can't understand it all the way. And so it might be 25, 30, 40 years later before they're done with it, because it might take that long to work it all the way through. Me? I have a question?
He wants you to point out what you want to
Right there.
Okay, my question would be about a traumatic brain injury done late teens, early adulthood. the damage that is done and the behaviors that maybe have come rolling through over the last 20 years, but it has never been addressed.
Mm-hmm.
What are the options? Because a lot of the behaviors that you're seeing, I'm no good,
Yep.
nobody loves me, I'm a bad person, da da da.
Yep. Did the TBI happen through a traumatic event or an accident?
It was the hind legs of a bull on the face of So it was a full centimeter compression and 8 hours of surgery the next day.
So traumatic event.
And the injury was never addressed. Nobody ever said, "Oh, well, you should have them checked." And
Yeah. So definitely traumatic event, and a TBI to boot. So the TBI is going to cause physiological damage in the brain, and so again, capacity, and the traumatic event itself is going to do everything we talked about tonight, and then you add a TBI on top of it. So it's like a double whammy in one shot. For a TBI, there are things you can do for the anxiety and emotions and stress that come because of the TBI, but you can't go in and physiologically repair what the TBI did. But you can gain some skill in dealing with the anxiety, stress, and emotional components of it, but even that's limited.
Not to belabor it, but back to the prenatal. She was talking about the pre-verbal and not being able to express it. I'm assuming hypnotherapy would help with that, getting the emotion and transitioning that emotion. It
would help with. Okay, so it helps in a very specific way because hypnosis is symbolic in nature. You can symbolically work things out, but you'll never have the language or actual description of it to work through. So it's all going to be symbolic. Like play therapy with kids is 100% symbolic. It's just not hypnotic. So you do the hypnotic stuff or hypnosis, you're again working in symbolic language and tools, but you may never talk about the actual thing. Does that?
Will it resolve it though?
It can, but again, the person's never going to know it because they can't tell you.
Right. So, but that won't go to prenatal? It won't go through there?
Because of what happens prenatal is physiological in the brain, it can't repair physiological damage.
Okay.
Any studies done that an infant before birth almost passes away before birth and has an emergency C-section, what is the effects of that later in life? Is there any effects from that later in life?
Okay, do it again.
Okay. An infant that almost passes away at birth because the infant's too big and then has an emergency C-section to be able to survive.
Okay.
What is the effects of that later in life, or is there any correlation between those details?
So.
And the doctors didn't find anything.
So this was all at the time of birth. There wasn't a whole lot of separation in time between the too big to be born and the C-section. It was all bam, bam. Okay. So, based on everything we've talked about and the extent of my knowledge, which is not that huge, they could come out of that unscathed, depending on physiological trauma through birth, meaning the C-section. So, if there was any physical or physiological damage from the birth complication being too big, basically a skull bouncing off of bones, maybe, but maybe not, because there's a lot of stuff in between. And then also the birth process itself. Some C-sections are traumatic for the baby. So it depends. If they get through both of those without a whole lot, then good prognosis.
Speaking as a nurse to that question.
I knew we had one in the room.
If there was any lack of oxygen
Yep.
trauma to the child, and there's a lot of things that could be lack of oxygen in that time, there might be some trauma to deal with later.
Physical trauma.
Physical trauma.
Yeah.
And might do a little bit of damage to the brain
Yep.
too.
Lack of oxygen
But
for
if
sure.
you didn't have any, if they were quick enough and there was no apneic period, they should do okay, as far as I know.
I have a couple questions. I have a good friend who's an ex-Marine, served in Vietnam. And when I invited him to come tonight, he declined because triggers,
Yep.
sleep, whatnot. Another friend of mine, also an ex-Marine, I worked with, I walked up behind him once and he said, "Don't ever walk up behind me." Again, that sense
Yep.
of self-defense. And then you mentioned two of my all-time favorite characters, Joseph and King David. Have you ever heard about any father situation with King David? And what I mean by that is when the prophet's coming, he looks at all the boys and he says, "Nope, nope, nope, nope. Do you have any other sons?" Now, the terminology I've heard recently is, "Oh yeah, I have a Hakaton," which is a worthless one.
Okay.
And that's how David's father referred to. He's out with the sheep. He's not.
Yeah.
And that would play
Yeah.
a trigger.
If he's going to
trauma.
describe his son that way to a stranger, what's he going to say in the house? I am not the Bible scholar. I tried to talk Paul into that version of things. No, I don't know anything specific about any of that. But like I said, read the scriptures with a mental health lens, and you'll start seeing all kinds of stuff. But it would be fascinating. If I ever get my PhD, I would love to do it at a Christian university and take apart the Bible through a mental health lens and look at all of that kind of stuff, because there's so much there. And the life of David, from his ancestors to his descendants, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, that's a genealogical gold mine of a tree for people like me. So who else? We'll take a couple more. There's one. Over here. Let's go over here.
Question: what are your thoughts on EMDR, and do you use that in your practice? I'm just really curious.
You weren't here last week because I talked about that. EMDR is wonderful stuff. It works for 73% of the people. The other 27%, they don't know why it doesn't work. It can be used for pretty much anything, even though it started with vets coming back from Iraq. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is the cat's meow right now of my world. Everybody and their dog is getting trained in it. And again, some of that's good and some of that's not good. So you want the really good trained people, not the fly-by-night people. It's good stuff. You gotta really know the person who's using it and how they were trained, but then also you don't know if you're in that 27% or not. So, and it has to do with how memories are stored in the brain and processed, and it has to do with basically the midline of your brain and moving stuff across. That's how you process. And the analogy I used last week was, imagine myself and a client walking next to a set of train tracks going from point A to point B. It'll take us X amount of time to walk there. That's walk and talk therapy, basically. the train is EMDR, just moving a whole lot faster because it moves at the speed of the brain instead of the speed of your lips.
So have you seen EMDR be effective with people with TBIs?
For anxiety, stress, and learning how to manage that stuff, yes. I actually had a client once who was referred to me because I did EMDR, and the client's doctor, the person was in a wreck and had a TBI and was having anxiety because of it, so they sent him to me. We did EMDR for the wreck, not on the wreck, but on the anxiety, and it alleviated a lot of the anxiety. Somebody else over here had their hand up. Okay, fine, over here.
So with like steps of recovery, would you say it's good to intentionally trigger yourself?
No.
Like for somebody in the car wreck, would it be good to go drive on that same highway?
Only if it's a part of a recovery process that's being guided by somebody else. Now, yes, when you have a horse accident, they say get back up on the horse and ride. That's a different thing. If we're talking about a true, I can't use that word. If we're talking about if it's a wreck, maybe, and it depends on the severity. If it's anything else, I'd say no way, not until they're ready through a defined process. Okay, this is your second question, so
Okay.
you owe the table cookies next week.
Okay, sounds good. What would you recommend for, it's my brother in particular, who like has gone through trauma and has been a part of causing a lot of trauma, but who refuses to like, I mean, he like checked every box on like everything you mentioned, but he refuses like any help or, I mean, he's 20. So he thinks, oh, I'm fine, but he's not.
Yeah.
What would you like recommend for someone?
What can I recommend if
Yeah.
he's not willing to go to counseling, if he's
Yes.
not willing to recognize the damage he's causing, if
Yeah.
he's not willing to recognize how it's affecting him?
Yeah.
Some people are only going to learn from the school of hard knocks.
Yeah.
They're going to wait until they hit rock bottom to do anything about it.
Yeah,
And
that's what I-
unfortunately, that's a lot of relational damage in that person's life.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of going that way, but I was just curious.
Yep.
Your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I brought apples, so that should count. On the tree, newborns that have been exposed to drugs and fetal alcohol syndrome, and you talk about capacity. Are you getting at IQ? I want to.
Yeah,
I want to be sensitive as to their functioning capacity in life, work.
So mainly in emotion regulation, relationships, and understanding social cues is a big part of that. You look at fetal alcohol syndrome kids; they really struggle with social and emotional cues. They can't. When somebody else around them is upset, it doesn't register to them. So the parts of the brain that help interpret that are damaged. So smoking, drugs, alcohol, physical abuse, anything that affects the mother's body is going to affect the baby's body, and that's where the pruning happens. And I'm using the word pruning on purpose because there's a process that happens in the brain. We'll talk about it next week. It literally prunes dendrites in the brain, so that the physical structures where memory and capacity and everything else would be stored are just not there. Okay, way over here.
Yeah, my question's a bit related to the last question. If there were free mental health care, let's just say for everyone that needed it, wanted it, what would be the percentage of people who need it, who actually would seek it?
So
I know it's a hypothetical question, but
yeah. What are you including in that? Are you including marriage counseling? Are you talking about grief counseling? Are you throwing everything in there?
well, mainly trauma, like
Okay.
people who have trauma.
So trauma, based on the statistics, we're talking about anywhere from 10 to 70%. But that's a huge gap. If you add to that, well, I mean, take this valley. The Flathead Valley is roughly 150,000 people, okay? If you look in the phone book, there's 100 therapists. You call all of them, only 30 are taking new clients. We know that the utilization rate of mental health services in this valley is 15%. So 15% of the people are looking for mental health help. We don't have enough counselors. We don't have enough psychiatrists. We don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough psychologists. And that's across the board. If we narrow that down to even 10%, we still don't have enough. I've got roughly 20 people on my caseload and a waiting list of 6. There's only so much I can do. But that's everybody. It's very common that we get a phone call at my group practice and we're the only one that called back and they called 20 places. Either everybody's full or they heard something in the voicemail they didn't want to work with, or I don't know. It happens all the time. If we throw everything into the bucket, marriage counseling, grief counseling, divorce care, parenting, you throw everything in there, we all need it. Sorry. Does that answer your question? Hold on.
So the people who are trying to call, or at least have called, and they are seeking help, that's, you said, less than 10% of actual people that need it?
We're only one place.
Yeah.
Our waiting list right now for Medicaid clients is a year long.
I guess my question is like, if you know someone in your life, they're an adult, they would benefit. You think that they would benefit from therapy, but they're not interested at all. I would think that that's the majority. Maybe I'm wrong.
I wouldn't say it's the majority, especially since COVID. COVID changed everything. Mental health COVID took a lot of the stigma off of mental health. It really did. Of course, you're always going to have those people that are just going to gut their way through life and say it's no big deal or whatever. But the vast majority of people now are going, okay, mental health's a real deal. COVID did a number on us. We saw this in our own home. We need some help, whatever version of that there is. But the access is a big problem. I think one of the statistics I talked about with Paul is 63% of U.S. counties don't have a psychiatrist in them, but every county has multiple churches. The church could do a huge thing with mental health. It really could. It's going to take some training and some time, but there's a lot of churches out there that are going in that direction. As far as availability of services, there are so many grants and programs for free or low-cost access to mental health everywhere. It's incredible. But there's not enough of it. There's just that level of need. So, one or two more. Right here.
What is our best response to family and friends who have experienced trauma? Is it to leave them alone, to engage them? how?
It's similar to what we talked about last week with depression. Number one, you're not going to change what they think, so don't even try. Number two, when they say things that sound weird, you don't have to validate the parts that are fantasy-based. Validate the person. You know, I love you. I think God has great things for you. Can I give you a hug? That may be the extent of what you can offer, because again, they're not going to trust anybody. And for a trauma survivor to allow somebody into their personal space and their personal world is huge. It's like I have a particular client right now, and the compliments she gives me are off the charts because it's the only place she can be herself. It's the only place where she lets her guard down. It's the only place where she feels safe. And her most recent compliment is, "This is my space," which I almost said something to, but I didn't because it's mine. But that's what you're going to be dealing with. It's not something you're going to talk them out of. It's not something you can talk them to a different place on. You just have to be there to support them and love them. Let them know that you're there to listen or whatever, if they want to talk, if they want to do anything about it. Always encourage somebody to seek counseling and professional help. Absolutely. You're going to get a mixed bag on whether or not they're going to take that up, though. Last one over here.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Todd, very much for taking on this assignment and doing such a great job. And to talk to all the folks here, which is a microcosm of what you were referring to. There are about 150 churches in the Flathead Valley between Whitefish and Polson. I know you don't know everything, but God does, and He really cares for how we handle this in the church, to bring the church together, to show the world what the church can do. And you have to bring that down a notch. But from what you were saying, what do you think the role of the church here in the Valley could potentially be with the mental health awareness and treatment and counseling?
That's a big question.
It is. It's huge.
And we are trying to figure out how we're going to end this series right now. It's kind of morphing a little bit. I think the church could play a huge role in that. This valley has a tremendous problem with drugs, and alcohol goes along with that. And so there's a lot that could be done that way. I moved here from Phoenix, and in Phoenix, Arizona, you almost couldn't shake a stick without hitting an adult alcohol and drug rehab. So a lot of them were not necessarily church-based, but Christian-based. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot that can be done in that side of the equation. And again, most drug and alcohol started with a trauma or something bad happening in their life. I think the church's attitude toward mental health is going to have to change. And I think you guys for showing up. This has been a tremendous response to this. And what it shows me is there is a hunger for knowledge, and possibly, depending on how we end this, a hunger for action on this topic. I think, like I said, there's some churches that would call me the spawn of Satan for sitting here and doing this because of how they think about it. You know, whether that's a whole nother topic. So churches' attitudes need to change. Christians' attitudes need to change. That's a monumental project. Can it be done? Absolutely. God can do anything He wants, anytime He wants to. And I would love to be a part of something like that. Doing this with you guys, I'd love to do this with other churches. I just never had anybody ask before. I had to ask to do this. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it starts to, Todd. You and I need to talk some more. But once again, I'll go back to Pastor Ball here and say, thank you so much for allowing Todd and for hearing God's heart, I think, through Todd, for having this set of lessons in front of the whole church. And this is a model for what the church can and should do right here and right now. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Good job, you guys.
Well, thank you. Let me give you a teaser for next week. Next week is brain health, one of my favorite topics to talk about. You'll probably have to shut me up at 2 hours. I got on the road learning about brain stuff, where are we, 23, about 5 years ago. My introduction was actually a horse therapy training I went to in Tucson, Arizona. And evidently there is a lot of similarities between a horse's brain and a human's brain, how we process information. So that was my introduction to it, and ever since then, and even a little bit before then, I don't spare any expense to find continuing education offerings on brain stuff, because there's so much there. And the more I've learned about it and paired it with what I know about relationships, it makes everything make sense. And that's what you're going to get next week. Okay? So I hope to see you, and I hope I see more cookies next time. Thanks for coming.